The rain fell in a steady drizzle, painting the streets of Eastwood in shades of gray. It wasn't the kind of rain that soaked you through in minutes, but the kind that made everything look dull, cold, and almost forgotten. Aidan Carter stood under the awning of a small, forgotten bookstore at the edge of town, staring at the worn-out sign that swayed gently in the breeze. Eastwood Books, a place that hadn't seen much business in years. The little town of Eastwood hadn't changed much either. Time seemed to have forgotten it. Aidan's fingers twitched with the urge to check his watch, but he didn't. It didn't matter what time it was anymore. All that mattered was this moment, the one that had been pulling him back here for weeks, the one he had been trying to ignore, trying to outrun. The letter that had come without any return address. The letter that had no name on it, but had his heart racing with fear the moment he opened it. He had never thought he'd return to Eastwood, not after everything that had happened. His past here wasn't a collection of memories he enjoyed. It wasn't a place he could look back on with any kind of nostalgia. Yet here he was, standing in front of the very church where everything had changed. "I know what you did," the letter had said. Those words had burned themselves into his mind, playing over and over as he lay in bed each night. He'd thought about ignoring it, tossing it aside as just another prank or mistake. But the truth was, deep down, Aidan knew he couldn't ignore it. The rain grew heavier, slapping against the pavement, but Aidan stood still, his gaze fixed on the old church. His chest felt tight. This wasn't just a visit. This was something different, something deeper. Eastwood was a place where secrets had been buried deep in the earth, but they always had a way of resurfacing. That was the curse of small towns. The walls had ears, and the stories never truly stayed hidden. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes wandered to the old building. It hadn't changed much in the years since he left. The stone walls were still chipped, the stained glass windows still cracked, though they were barely visible through the heavy rain. It had always felt like a place of sorrow to him, a place that had been stained by too many lost hopes and unspoken words. Aidan had promised himself that he wouldn't return. He had promised his mother, on her deathbed, that he wouldn't come back to this town, wouldn't come back to the pain. But now, as he stood there in front of the church, he realized that he wasn't just facing his past. He was facing something he hadn't expected, something more dangerous, something more haunting than the memories of a boy who had lost everything. He took a slow, steady breath, gathering his thoughts. He had to do this. For his mother. For himself. He couldn't run anymore. He stepped away from the bookstore and crossed the street. His shoes splashed in the growing puddles, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, back in time, to the day he left Eastwood. It had been a year since his mother's passing, but it felt like a lifetime. He remembered the look in her eyes, the way she held his hand as she whispered her last words. "Promise me, Aidan. Promise me you'll never come back here." He had promised. And yet, here he was. The church loomed ahead, its large wooden doors cracked open just slightly. Aidan felt a chill run down his spine. There was no one around, no one to stop him. He could turn back now. He could get in his car, drive back to the city, and forget this place ever existed. But he couldn't. The letter had made sure of that. The words haunted him. The letter had known something that only he could answer. And the only way to answer it was to face it head-on. The heavy oak doors creaked as Aidan pushed them open. Inside, the church was dimly lit by the faint glow of candles along the altar. The air smelled of damp wood and dust, a smell that seemed to cling to the walls. There were no pews, no chairs, just rows of empty spaces that stretched into darkness. Aidan's footsteps echoed as he walked further inside, his heart beating faster with every step. "Hello." His voice barely broke the silence. There was no answer. He stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the church. The rain beat against the roof, drowning out the world outside. For a brief second, he wondered if he was imagining all of this. The letter, the return, the strange sense of dread in his chest. Maybe it was all just some terrible nightmare that he hadn't woken up from yet. But then he saw it. At the far end of the church, near the altar, a figure stood in the shadows. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness. Aidan's heart skipped a beat. The person didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, as still as the stone walls surrounding them. "Who's there?" Aidan called again, his voice more strained this time, his hands clenched into fists by his sides. The figure stepped forward, and Aidan's breath caught in his throat. It was a face he hadn't seen in years, yet one he would never forget. Lucas, the man who had once been his best friend, the man who had betrayed him, the man who had changed everything. Aidan's heart slammed against his chest, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. His mouth went dry. Lucas was still as sharp and cold as ever. His eyes locked onto Aidan's, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. "I knew you'd come," Lucas said, his voice low and almost amused. Aidan didn't say anything. He just stared at him, struggling to form words. This wasn't what he had expected. He had come here thinking he was going to face something else, a piece of his past, maybe, but not this. Not Lucas. "I thought you'd be smarter than this, Aidan," Lucas continued, stepping closer. His dark eyes gleamed in the half-light of the church. "But you never were you? You always came back to Eastwood. You always came back to me." Aidan wanted to say something, wanted to scream at him, but the words wouldn't come. He was trapped, locked in a memory of the past, standing face to face with a person who had once been his everything. Lucas was standing right there, like a ghost, and for a moment, Aidan didn't know if he was still dreaming. "I'm not the same person I was back then," Aidan finally said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "And you're not the same either." Lucas smiled, but it wasn't a smile that reached his eyes. "We never change, Aidan. You think you're different, but you're still running. Running from everything. Running from me." Aidan's pulse quickened. He didn't know what Lucas was talking about, but something inside him told him that the answers he had come for were right there, buried in the shadows of that old church, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't run anymore. Not from Lucas, not from his past, not from the truth. And as the rain fell harder against the roof, Aidan knew that everything had just changed. The cold wind blew through the quiet streets of Eastwood, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and old memories. Aidan Carter stood outside the church, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. His fingers curled into fists, not because of the cold, but because of the storm raging inside him. He had come back to this town after years of staying away, but now that he was here, he wasn't sure if he had made the right decision. The past had a strange way of pulling him back, no matter how hard he tried to escape it. For years, he had convinced himself that he had moved on, that Eastwood no longer had any power over him. But standing here now, he realized how wrong he had been. The memories were still fresh, still raw. The town hadn't changed, but something inside him had. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He didn't want to be here. He had promised himself he would never come back, but the letter had changed everything. Someone knew about his past, about what had happened all those years ago, and whoever it was wanted him to face it. Aidan glanced around the empty street. The rain had stopped, but the air was still thick with moisture. The dim streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. Everything about this place felt the same. It was almost unsettling how time seemed to have stood still here. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories come. He had been just a boy when his father disappeared. He could still remember the way his mother had cried that night, her sobs echoing through the small house. She had tried to hide her pain, tried to stay strong for him. But Aidan had seen the truth in her eyes. She had been broken. After that, life had never been the same. His mother had worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. She had sacrificed everything for him, always putting his needs before her own. Aidan had hated seeing her struggle, had hated the way the world seemed so unfair. As he grew older, he became more aware of the things people whispered about his family. People talked about his father's disappearance like it was some kind of dark secret, something no one wanted to discuss openly. Aidan had never understood why. No one ever gave him real answers. It was as if his father had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but questions. He had spent years trying to find the truth, but no matter how hard he searched, he always hit a dead end. Eventually, he stopped asking. It was easier that way. Aidan opened his eyes, shaking off the memories. He wasn't here to relive the past. He was here to find answers. The rain fell in a steady drizzle, painting the streets of Eastwood in shades of gray. It wasn't the kind of rain that soaked you through in minutes, but the kind that made everything look dull, cold, and almost forgotten. Aidan Carter stood under the awning of a small, forgotten bookstore at the edge of town, staring at the worn-out sign that swayed gently in the breeze. Eastwood Books, a place that hadn't seen much business in years. The little town of Eastwood hadn't changed much either. Time seemed to have forgotten it. Aidan's fingers twitched with the urge to check his watch, but he didn't. It didn't matter what time it was anymore. All that mattered was this moment, the one that had been pulling him back here for weeks, the one he had been trying to ignore, trying to outrun. The letter that had come without any return address. The letter that had no name on it, but had his heart racing with fear the moment he opened it. He had never thought he'd return to Eastwood, not after everything that had happened. His past here wasn't a collection of memories he enjoyed. It wasn't a place he could look back on with any kind of nostalgia. Yet here he was, standing in front of the very church where everything had changed. "I know what you did," the letter had said. Those words had burned themselves into his mind, playing over and over as he lay in bed each night. He'd thought about ignoring it, tossing it aside as just another prank or mistake. But the truth was, deep down, Aidan knew he couldn't ignore it. The rain grew heavier, slapping against the pavement, but Aidan stood still, his gaze fixed on the old church. His chest felt tight. This wasn't just a visit. This was something different, something deeper. Eastwood was a place where secrets had been buried deep in the earth, but they always had a way of resurfacing. That was the curse of small towns. The walls had ears, and the stories never truly stayed hidden. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes wandered to the old building. It hadn't changed much in the years since he left. The stone walls were still chipped, the stained glass windows still cracked, though they were barely visible through the heavy rain. It had always felt like a place of sorrow to him, a place that had been stained by too many lost hopes and unspoken words. Aidan had promised himself that he wouldn't return. He had promised his mother, on her deathbed, that he wouldn't come back to this town, wouldn't come back to the pain. But now, as he stood there in front of the church, he realized that he wasn't just facing his past. He was facing something he hadn't expected, something more dangerous, something more haunting than the memories of a boy who had lost everything. He took a slow, steady breath, gathering his thoughts. He had to do this. For his mother, for himself. He couldn't run anymore. He stepped away from the bookstore and crossed the street. His shoes splashed in the growing puddles, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, back in time, to the day he left Eastwood. It had been a year since his mother's passing, but it felt like a lifetime. He remembered the look in her eyes, the way she held his hand as she whispered her last words. "Promise me, Aidan. Promise me you'll never come back here." He had promised. And yet, here he was. The church loomed ahead, its large wooden doors cracked open just slightly. Aidan felt a chill run down his spine. There was no one around, no one to stop him. He could turn back now. He could get in his car, drive back to the city, and forget this place ever existed. But he couldn't. The letter had made sure of that. The words haunted him. The letter had known something, something that only he could answer. And the only way to answer it was to face it head on. The heavy oak doors creaked as Aidan pushed them open. Inside, the church was dimly lit by the faint glow of candles along the altar. The air smelled of damp wood and dust, a smell that seemed to cling to the walls. There were no pews, no chairs, just rows of empty spaces that stretched into darkness. Aidan's footsteps echoed as he walked further inside, his heart beating faster with every step. "Hello!" His voice barely broke the silence. There was no answer. He stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the church. The rain beat against the roof, drowning out the world outside. For a brief second, he wondered if he was imagining all of this. The letter, the return, the strange sense of dread in his chest. Maybe it was all just some terrible nightmare that he hadn't woken up from yet. But then he saw it. At the far end of the church, near the altar, a figure stood in the shadows. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness. Aidan's heart skipped a beat. The person didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, as still as the stone walls surrounding them. "You sent it?" She shook her head quickly. "No, but I knew you would get one." Aidan frowned. "What do you mean?" Emily took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Someone's been watching you, Aidan. Watching and waiting. And now that you're here, they won't stop." His jaw clenched. "Who?" Emily swallowed hard. "I don't know, but they know the truth. About that night. About what really happened." Aidan felt his breath hitch. That night. The night he had spent years trying to forget. The night that had changed everything. His mind raced. He had never spoken about that night to anyone. No one was supposed to know. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "How do they know?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know, but they do. And if they sent you that letter, it means they want you to remember." Aidan ran a hand through his hair. He didn't want to remember. But now, it seemed like he had no choice. Emily shifted uncomfortably. "You have to be careful, Aidan. If they know, that means they're watching. And if they're watching, it means they're waiting for you to make a mistake." Aidan exhaled sharply. Why now? After all these years? Emily hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. She handed it to him. He unfolded it and felt his blood run cold. It was the same message. "I know what you did." Aidan looked up at her. "You got one too." Emily nodded. 2 days ago. That's why I knew you would get one too." Aidan's mind was spinning. Someone was playing a game with them. Someone who knew the past, who knew the secrets they had buried. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in. "What do we do?" Emily asked. Aidan didn't have an answer, because for the first time in years, he felt truly afraid. The air inside the motel room felt heavy, thick with the weight of old secrets and the fear of what was coming next. Aidan Carter stood by the window, his eyes fixed on the dark street outside. The neon motel sign flickered, casting a dull glow over the nearly empty parking lot. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, tension rolling through him like a storm. He could hear Emily behind him, shifting uneasily, her breath unsteady. Everything had changed in just a few hours. When he first arrived in Eastwood, he thought he was coming back to confront ghosts of the past. He thought the worst thing he would have to deal with was his own regret. But now, there was something much bigger at play. Someone was watching. Someone knew about that night. And now, Emily was caught up in it too. Aidan turned back to face her. She was standing near the bed, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to make herself smaller. She looked the same as he remembered, tired eyes, the same nervous way she bit her lip when she was thinking. But there was something else in her now, something broken. "You need to tell me everything you know," Aidan said, his voice firm. Emily hesitated. "I already told you. I got the letter, just like you. That's all I know." Aidan narrowed his eyes. "No, there's more. You knew I was coming back before I even told anyone. And you said someone's been watching me. That means you've seen them, or at least you know who they are. Emily shook her head quickly. I don't know who they are, Aiden, but I felt it. The way you feel when someone's looking at you, even when you can't see them. The way shadows move when they shouldn't. It's been happening for weeks now. Aiden frowned. Weeks? Emily swallowed hard. I think it started after I visited your mother. Aiden's stomach tightened. My mother. She nodded. She called me. Said she needed to talk to me. I hadn't spoken to her in years, Aiden. Not since you left. But she sounded scared. Aiden felt a chill creep down his spine. His mother had always been a strong woman. She had endured more than most people could handle, and she never let fear control her. If she was afraid, then something was very, very wrong. What did she say? He asked. Emily looked down at her hands. She asked about you, wanted to know if I had heard from you. And then she said something strange. She told me to be careful. She said the past wasn't as buried as we thought it was. Aiden's jaw tightened. His mother had known something. And now she was in danger too. Without another word, he grabbed his jacket from the chair and headed for the door. Emily's eyes widened. Where are you going? Aiden didn't stop. To see my mother. Emily hurried after him. Wait, you can't just go storming in like this. If someone's watching, they'll know. Aiden turned to her, his expression dark. Then let them know. I'm done playing games. The drive to his mother's house was short, but it felt like hours. The town looked different at night, quieter, emptier. The streetlights flickered like they were struggling to stay alive. Emily stepped closer, her expression softening. Aiden, you have to face it. If we're going to find your mother, if we're going to stop this, you have to understand what you're up against. You have to face the truth. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of her words settle over him. The truth. The truth was that for years, he had been running. He had been running from his father's disappearance. Running from his own guilt. He had convinced himself that by leaving Eastwood, he could leave behind everything that haunted him. But he couldn't. The past had caught up with him. And now it had taken the one person he loved most in the world. He opened his eyes and turned toward Emily, determination settling in his chest. I'm not running anymore. Then we need to go to the police, Emily said, her voice more urgent now. We can't do this alone. Aiden shook his head. The police won't help. They never have. If they knew anything, they would have found my father years ago. No, Emily, this is something I have to do. We need to find out who's behind this. Emily hesitated, but then she nodded. Okay, but we need a plan. We can't just walk into this blindly. Aiden nodded, his mind already working, piecing together the fragments of the past. The letter, his mother's disappearance, the feeling that had never left him, that gnawing sense that something had been wrong for a long time. He knew now that it wasn't just his mother they were after. It was him. The truth he had been running from. They'd wanted him to face it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the one name he had hoped he would never have to call again. Lucas. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Lucas had been his best friend, his partner in everything. Until that night, the night everything had fallen apart. Aiden had always believed that Lucas had betrayed him, that he had been part of the reason his father had disappeared. But now, as the truth started to sink in, he wasn't so sure. The phone rang 3 times before Lucas picked up. Hello. Lucas's voice sounded distant, guarded. It's Aiden, he said, his voice firm. We need to talk. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Lucas spoke, his voice low and tense. I figured you'd come sooner or later. Aiden's heart raced. I need to know the truth. About that night. About my father. You really want to know, don't you? Lucas said, his voice now cold. You think you can handle it? I have to, Aiden replied, his voice steady. And if you don't tell me, I swear I'll find out on my own. There was a long pause before Lucas spoke again. All right. Meet me at the old barn. You know the place. Aiden's stomach twisted. The old barn. The place where it all started. Don't make me wait long, Lucas added before hanging up. Aiden put the phone down and turned to Emily. We're going to the barn. She looked at him, her expression filled with worry. Aiden, are you sure? This is it, isn't it? This is where everything ends. Aiden nodded. This is where I end it. The truth, the lies, it all ends tonight. And with that, they left the house, heading into the night, towards the place where everything would finally come to light. The truth was waiting for him. And this time, Aiden Carter wasn't running anymore. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale silver light over the dark road as Aiden and Emily drove toward the old barn. The wind howled outside the car, rattling the windows, but inside, it was eerily quiet. Aiden's mind raced with every possible scenario, each darker than the last. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, the rough edges of the metal digging into his palms. Emily sat beside him, her face pale in the dim light of the dashboard. She didn't say a word, but he could feel her tension, the same fear that gripped him. Whatever waited for them at the barn wasn't just answers. It was the end of something they had both tried to outrun for years. The barn was just ahead. Its silhouette loomed against the night, an abandoned place that had once held so many memories, some good, most bad. This was where Aiden had spent hours with Lucas and others, where they had laughed, talked, and dreamed. But those dreams had turned into nightmares, and the barn had become a place of silence, a reminder of the mistakes that had haunted him. Aiden parked the car, the engine rumbling to a stop. He didn't move for a moment, just staring ahead at the darkened structure. He could almost hear the ghosts of the past whispering in the wind. Are you ready for this? Emily's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. He nodded slowly, not trusting his voice to answer. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but it didn't matter. The truth was here. It had always been here. They got out of the car, the cold night air biting at their skin. Aiden's breath came out in small clouds as he moved toward the barn. Every step felt like a weight dragging him down, but he couldn't stop. The door of the barn creaked as he pushed it open, the sound sending a chill down his spine. Inside, the barn was as he remembered, old wooden beams, broken windows, and dust covering everything. The faint smell of hay and rust lingered in the air, mixed with the scent of something more metallic, something that made his stomach churn. Lucas, Aiden called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. He waited, but there was no answer. His heart began to beat faster. Something wasn't right. Emily stepped closer, her eyes darting around the barn, scanning the shadows. Aiden, I don't think he's here. But Aiden's eyes had already landed on something, a piece of paper, lying on the floor near the far wall. He bent down to pick it up, the crinkled edges making a sharp sound as he unfolded it. You're too late. His blood ran cold. The words were simple, but they were a death sentence. Someone had been here. Someone was watching. And whatever had happened in this barn had been waiting for this moment to unfold. Before he could say anything, the sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the barn. Aiden tensed, his breath catching in his throat. He turned to face the sound, his body on high alert. The shadows shifted, and then, stepping into the weak light from the broken windows, was Lucas. His face was drawn, his eyes darker than Aiden remembered. He looked tired, older, like he had seen too many things he wished he could forget. But there was no mistaking the look in his eyes. It was the same one Aiden had seen in his own reflection. Regret. Guilt. I knew you'd come, Lucas said, his voice rough. But I didn't think you'd bring her. He nodded toward Emily, who stood close to Aiden, her eyes never leaving Lucas. Where's my mother, Lucas? Aiden's voice was steady, but inside, his heart was hammering. What have you done? Lucas didn't answer right away. He stepped further into the barn, his shoes crunching against the dirt floor. Aiden followed his movements carefully, but he kept his distance. There was something in the air, something that made his instincts scream to be cautious. "She's safe," Lucas finally said, his voice low. "For now." Aiden's fist clenched. "What do you mean, for now?" Lucas sighed, his shoulders slumping. "You don't understand, Aiden. None of this was ever supposed to happen. But you keep digging, and now." He trailed off, shaking his head as if he was torn between guilt and something else, something darker. "I need you to explain, Lucas," Aiden said, his voice harder this time. "You took my mother. You're telling me she's safe. After everything." "She's not the target, Aiden. You are." Lucas's words hit Aiden like a punch to the chest. He staggered back, the words echoing in his mind. "Me?" Aiden whispered, confused and angry. "What are you talking about?" Lucas's eyes darkened. "You have no idea, do you? You don't even know what happened that night, do you? The night your father disappeared." Aiden's head spun. "What are you saying? What happened?" Lucas took a deep breath and stepped closer, his voice almost too quiet to hear. "It wasn't an accident. Your father didn't disappear by chance. He chose to leave, and he did it to protect you." Aiden's heart stopped. His mind couldn't make sense of the words. His father chose to leave, protect him. It didn't make sense. "You're lying," Aiden said, shaking his head. "I've spent my whole life looking for answers. I've been running from the truth. And now you're telling me that he just left." Lucas looked at him, his eyes filled with regret. "I wish I were lying. But I'm not. Your father was part of something bigger than any of us. He tried to protect you, but when he realized it was going to cost him everything, he made the hardest decision he could make. He disappeared to keep you safe from the people who wanted to use you." "Who wanted to use me?" Aiden's voice cracked. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. The truth, the real truth, was breaking him apart. "It's not over, Aiden," Lucas continued. "They've been watching you. They've been waiting for you to come back. And now that you're here, they think it's time. They want what your father protected." Aiden's mind was spinning. Everything he had thought was real. The search for his father, his mother's fear, the mysterious letters, was all connected to something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. "Who are they, Lucas? Who are you working with?" Aiden's voice was raw, filled with disbelief. "I'm not working with anyone," Lucas said, his voice filled with pain. "I didn't have a choice. They threatened to hurt you. They threatened to hurt your mother if I didn't help them. But I couldn't keep running anymore. I couldn't keep being part of this." Aiden's mind raced. "Where is my mother, Lucas? Where did they take her?" Lucas hesitated, his eyes flickering with fear. "I don't know. They moved her after they left the letter. But Aiden, you need to understand. This isn't just about your father or your mother. It's about you. You're the key to all of this." Aiden felt a wave of anger wash over him. The past was flooding him now, filling him with the memories of betrayal, of fear, of loss. Everything had been a lie, but it wasn't too late. He wouldn't let them win. "I'll find her," Aiden said, his voice low and steady, filled with resolve. "And I'll make sure you don't get away with this." Lucas took a step back, his face pale. "You don't understand. It's not over. You can't stop them." But Aiden wasn't listening anymore. His mind was clear. He had no choice but to fight. The truth had finally been revealed, and now it was time to make sure it wasn't buried again. The end of this nightmare was closer than he ever imagined. But one thing was certain: he wouldn't stop until it was finished, and no matter the cost, he would make them all pay. The night air was cold, but Aiden barely felt it. His mind was focused on only one thing: getting his mother back. The truth had hit him like a storm, shaking everything he had believed in. But now, standing at the edge of the abandoned warehouse, he knew there was no turning back. Emily was beside him, her eyes filled with quiet determination. She had been with him through everything, and even now, when danger was at its peak, she hadn't left his side. "This is it," she whispered. "Are you ready?" Aiden took a deep breath. "I have to be." They moved forward, pushing through the rusted metal doors. The warehouse was dark, the faint hum of electricity in the air. Shadows stretched across the walls, making the place feel even colder. But Aiden's heart pounded for another reason. He could feel it. His mother was here. A low voice echoed from the far side of the warehouse. Aiden's fists clenched as he recognized it. "Lucas!" Aiden stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Where is she?" Lucas stood in the center of the warehouse, his face drawn with exhaustion. He looked like a man who had lost everything, yet still held on to something fragile. He didn't move as Aiden approached. "She's safe," Lucas said quietly. Aiden's patience snapped. "Where is she?" Lucas sighed and motioned toward a dimly lit corner of the warehouse. A figure sat on a wooden chair, hands tied in front of her. Aiden's breath caught in his throat as he recognized her. His mother. "Mom." Aiden rushed forward, dropping to his knees as he pulled at the ropes. His mother, Eleanor, lifted her head weakly, her eyes filling with relief. "Aiden." Her voice was hoarse, but filled with love. "You came." Tears burned in Aiden's eyes as he worked to free her. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I should have been there." She placed a gentle hand on his face. "You're here now. That's all that matters." Behind them, Lucas shifted. Aiden turned to him, anger still burning in his chest. "Why?" His voice was thick with emotion. "Why did you do this?" Lucas looked down. "I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong." Aiden's hands tightened into fists. He had spent his life running from the past, from the pain. But now, seeing Lucas standing there, broken and lost, he realized something. Hate wouldn't heal him. Revenge wouldn't bring peace. "Then make it right," Aiden said. "Help us end this." Lucas hesitated. Then, slowly he nodded. "I will." The night stretched on, but the weight on Aiden's chest slowly lifted. He had found his mother. He had faced the truth, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. As they walked out of the warehouse, the first rays of dawn painted the sky in soft gold. Aiden held his mother's hand tightly, knowing that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Because in the end, love was stronger than fear, and family was worth fighting for.